What is going on, everybody? James Hancock here. I'm back with one of my favorite annual traditions where I'm going to count down my top 10 favorite books I discovered over the past year. Now, to be clear, I only read a few new books published in 2025, two of which are on this list. But I hope you'll enjoy what I think is a wide variety of literary fiction, nonfiction, trashy bestsellers, audio fiction, and the most obvious for this channel, books that have been turned into movies. And over the course of 2025, I read a ton of books that have been very successfully adapted into fantastic movies. So not to worry, if you prefer my movie commentary, there'll be plenty of clips related to those movie adaptations of those books scattered throughout this video. In any event, a few quick words before I get started. I'm not a literary critic and I don't pretend to be. I read books specifically for pleasure and I always have. And in this era of so much disposable video content turning us into total mongoloids, I find that books are an incredible refuge that help keep me sane. And don't get me wrong, I'm not above watching puppies licking babies and all that stupid bullshit that we all watch on a daily basis on YouTube and Instagram and TikTok and all that crap. But when it comes to media consumption and our overall media diet, I think we all need to supplement our diet with the occasional book. And what I always hear from people is, I would love to read more, but I don't have the time, or I don't have the patience, or I can't sit still, yada, yada, yada. There are a million excuses. And reading stamina is a thing, and what I always recommend to people is start with 5 minutes per day. While you're taking a dump in the morning or before you go to bed at night, just read for 5 minutes. Put your phone away, put your iPad away, turn the TV off, no distractions, but just read a short, easy book for 5 minutes. And after a week of reading 5 minutes a day, you might find yourself reading 10 minutes a day. And after a week of that, you might find yourself reading 15 minutes a day. And at a certain point, you'll find yourself reading between like 30 minutes to 60 minutes per day, which I would regard as a healthy level of reading, but don't take my word for it. Check out the Bret Easton Ellis podcast. He wrote, American Psycho and Less Than Zero and Rules of Attraction and all these incredible books. He reads for an hour a day, every day at the start of the day. And sometimes he reads, literary classics, and sometimes he's reading nonfiction, but he starts his day reading a book, and then he goes to work, etc., and so forth. And the most obvious benefit of all this reading is discovering incredible reading experiences, pure, undiluted storytelling where film and television, I love film and television, but you need an army to make a movie, you need an army to make a show, and oftentimes you get committee-driven storytelling and the singular, unique voice gets kind of drowned out and you lose that individual style. But when you're reading a great book, you are in the hands of that author and that author alone, and they take you on a journey. But let's get down to dollars and cents. The price is right when it comes to reading, because this time of year, money is tight, people are buying gifts, they're traveling, etc., and so forth. But for like basically 10 to 20 bucks, if you buy an incredible book, you'll read it for hours, if not days. And if you love it, you'll read it again. But when it comes to like the amount of money you're spending per hour of pleasure, but compare that to going to the movies where you might spend 20 or 25 bucks on the ticket and maybe 20, 25 bucks more on all the filth that we eat and drink while at the movies. And if you're taking friends, family, children, whatever, suddenly you're spending hundreds of dollars for basically a 2-hour shitty movie that probably everybody in the group is going to hate. And that is just the reality in 2025. But now that I've gotten my public service announcement out of the way, let's talk about some of the rules and criteria for this list. No short stories. And this is not a knock on short stories. I love short stories. I read a ton of great short stories over the year. I read some by Elmore Leonard, I read some by H.P. Lovecraft, and I read some by Rudyard Kipling, but unless I've read an entire compilation of short stories, it's not eligible for this list. Otherwise, I probably could have just made a list of my top 10 favorite short stories by H.P. Lovecraft, because I've been reading a ton of Lovecraft getting prepared for my Call of Cthulhu / Pulp Cthulhu campaign next year. And come to think of it, sooner rather than later, I'll do a video where I count down my top 10 favorite short stories by H.P. Lovecraft. In any case, to be considered for this list, either the fiction or nonfiction in question must come in the form of an entire book. Otherwise, The Man Who Would Be King would rank very highly. But speaking of The Man Who Would Be King, I'm going to strongly recommend people check out my recent video with Tony Stella, where we celebrated the 50th anniversary of John Huston's adaptation of Rudyard Kipling's story. It's 2.5 hours. If you love that story or love that movie, that video was made for you. And one last criteria, no audio fiction. And don't get me wrong, I love and adore audio fiction. I listen to audio fiction on a daily basis, but I don't count it as reading a book. Or at least I don't count it as reading a book if it's the first time that you've experienced it. Like earlier this year, I got on a big Stephen King kick, and I listened to some audiobooks of books that I'd already read, like Salem's Lot and Pet Sematary. And when you have a really good author reading a book that you're already familiar with, it's just riveting, glorious entertainment. And I stayed up very late many nights, just like, I guess I got to listen to another hour now. It's just completely and totally transfixed. And what I really love doing as I try to nod off at night, I will listen to audio fiction of H.P. Lovecraft stories that I've already read. There's something about like a 100-year-old, very like long, kind of old-fashioned mystery story or whatever, or cosmic horror, however you want to describe it. But it's just like, it's better than like ambient, it's better than any sort of sedative you could possibly have. But sometimes I'll spend a week listening and re-listening to the same short story over and over and over again until I finally get through the whole thing, because it's that good at helping me nod off at the end of the day. But to make it onto this list, I actually needed to crack open the book and hold it in my hands and read it line by line. And people might disagree with me on this, but when it comes to audio fiction, I feel like when you're experiencing it for the first time, your attention can wander. You can start, getting distracted by a million other things, and you'll kind of pretend like you're still listening, but you're not completely, totally invested in doing the work, like, reading like pen in hand and like making notes in the margins and that sort of thing. And one last thing, this is not criteria for the list. It's just a note. No spoilers. My goal with this list is to get people to read these books for the first time if they've not done so already. But if you want a big, bold, comprehensive deep dive into any of the texts being mentioned, I'm sure there are 1,000 videos on YouTube where people have already done so in superior fashion. But this is just meant to be a survey of what I read over the course of the year, and hopefully I can excite the curiosity of some people to check these books out for the first time. But time's a wasting, so let's just get down to it. This past year, I read a ton of Stephen King. There were 4 major new movies this past year based on Stephen King short stories, novellas, and novels, and that includes The Monkey, Life of Chuck, The Long Walk, and The Running Man. And prior to seeing The Monkey, I'd already read the short story from the collection Skeleton Crew. But for Life of Chuck, I read the story from the compilation If It Bleeds, which is a collection of different novellas. Prior to seeing The Long Walk, I read the Richard Bachman book. It says Stephen King on the cover, but it was originally published as a Richard Bachman book. And I also read The Running Man, which was published as a Richard Bachman book before he was outed as being one and the same person. But of all the Stephen King stories that I read for the first time in 2025, The Long Walk gets it done. My official number 10. So why did I go with The Long Walk over some of the other options for my number 10? I think what it boiled down to is that The Running Man, I just found it to be a bummer of a read. It was an effort. I had to force myself to read it. Whereas The Long Walk, it had basically been on my reading list, like to be read, since I was like 16 or 17. I can remember being in high school, 1,000 years ago, sitting there at breakfast where somebody was describing the plot of The Long Walk. They just read it. And just listening to them describe the scenario and the premise, I was like, that sounds cool as fucking shit. So here we are, more than 30 years later, I finally read The Long Walk. And I thought the movie was good.
Want to walk me a while?
Yeah. Yeah, I do, Pete.
They made a few changes that I didn't like cutting the number of boys from 100 down to 50, and they changed the ending. People are always changing Stephen King's ending. Sometimes it works out, like with The Shining, and sometimes it doesn't. But I thought The Running Man, they changed the ending and made it worse. The Long Walk, they changed the ending, they made it worse. The Monkey was such a total departure from the short story. It makes it tough to do a proper compare and contrast. But the endings of the short story and the movie were wildly different. And Life of Chuck was very faithful, but they just kind of embellished it and fleshed it out and added additional material because it was a pretty slender novella and it needed a little bit more meat on the bone to be a feature. But the Long Walk movie has some terrific acting and some great scenes. But the novel, because you're inside the head of the central protagonist, he goes on these lengthy, hallucinatory, exploratory journeys. Well, he'll be kind of half asleep on his feet and thinking about a million different things, where you just really get to understand this world and these characters. And it's a little bit more, I won't say perverse, but a little bit more sexually oriented, just because you have got a bunch of 18-year-old boys walking for days, and of course they're going to end up thinking about and talking about sex more often than not. But when it comes to grim dystopian futures, what is more grim and more dystopian than a story involving 100 18-year-old boys walking until only one remains? And over the course of the novel, you will fall in love with some of the characters, you will start to hate some of the characters. And I think the book does a little bit better job than the movie of fleshing out some of those characters, because in the movie they kind of folded a few of those characters together, which is another thing that I didn't like about the flick. But if I were to be totally blunt and totally honest about some of my Stephen King experiences this past year, I actually had more fun with the audiobook for Salem's Lot and Pet Sematary, but I'd already read those books a long time ago. So in that this is a video about the top 10 books that I discovered in 2025, Pet Sematary and Salem's Lot are not eligible. But goddamn, those are two of my all-time favorite Stephen King books, and they get my highest possible recommendation. But moving on to my number 9, we have Dr. No by Ian Fleming, which was adapted into the first James Bond movie back in 1962 with Sean Connery, but it's technically the 6th James Bond novel.
I admire your luck, Mr.
Bond.
James Bond.
If you look over my shoulder, you'll see some old copies of the James Bond novels that I ordered after the Ian Fleming estate, in their infinite wisdom, decided to start censoring Ian Fleming's books. And I'm like, why would anybody in their right mind want to read a censored version of an Ian Fleming novel? The whole reason we're reading the Ian Fleming novel is for the seductions and the gambling and the drug abuse and all the colorful language that some people might find a little bit outrageous in 2025. But it's like, I want the pure, raw, undiluted experience. And the craziest part of when the Ian Fleming estate decided to censor all the novels was how they removed from circulation all the old copies of the paperbacks like this one that were still uncensored. Like, you could no longer go on Amazon and order the real Ian Fleming book. So I ordered this collection through, I can't remember what the website, maybe it was eBay, but in any case, I was like, you don't get to decide what I read and what I don't read. I get to decide for myself what I will read and not read. And I don't want to get too sidetracked talking about censorship, but from my point of view, no matter what the goals and intentions of the individual censor might be, whether you are censoring books or movies or music or paintings or plays, if you are a censor of art, please, for the love of God, chug a glass of hydrochloric acid and fuck off while you're doing it, because in every era of human history, there are censors and buzzkills who will try to destroy works of art, and in every generation, they are wrong. Like my favorite example, you go to the Vatican, and you're checking out some of the best sculptures and best paintings in the history of civilization. But at one point, I think it was like in the 1500s or 1600s, they acquired a bunch of ancient Greek statues, and in their infinite wisdom, they added fig leaves to the nipples and penises and vajayjays of all the statues in question, because it was obscene to see the nude human form, and they did it in a way where you cannot remove the fig leaves. So they basically defaced and destroyed these priceless works of art that had been created like 1,500 years prior to their acquisition, but they knew better. They knew it needed to be censored. But the sad reality is censorship is nothing new, and it'll always be around, and every generation has to fight these battles against censorship all over again. In any case, my tirade is over. Let's get back to Ian Fleming. And the Ian Fleming books, I would say my favorite so far, the first like half or third of Moonraker, as well as From Russia with Love. But not to worry, From Russia with Love will be coming up later in this list. But I loved From Russia with Love. I liked Dr. No. Dr. No and From Russia with Love, basically there's a cliffhanger that leads you seamlessly right into the next. I was like, well, shit, I got to find out what happens. But with Dr. No, it's just a full-blown, straightforward kind of pulp adventure story where James Bond, he goes down to Jamaica. In theory, he's supposed to be resting and relaxing and recovering from all of his experiences and From Russia with Love. But what initially appears just to be a missing persons case turns into this crazy adventure where he goes to an exotic island ruled over by a colorful megalomaniac, and it is there where he encounters the lovely Honeychild, a.k.a. Honey Rider, played by Ursula Andress in the movie.
What are you doing here? Looking for shells?
No, I'm just looking.
Stay where you are.
And for me, the most enjoyable part of Dr. No by far was all the interactions between James Bond and Honey, as he basically gazes lustily and fantasizes about her at every available opportunity. But how can I say this without giving away spoilers? Let's just say if you like good old-fashioned pulp adventures, obviously Dr. No, this is the first James Bond novel for me where suddenly it starts to feel more like a superhero adventure story as opposed to a traditional spy novel. Because, Dr. No, he's got, mechanical hands, and he's got this exotic base. He quite literally has fucking, monsters on the island. You have the dragon, as they say in the movie and in the book. And there is a huge sea monster that James Bond has to battle with a knife and a spear. Like, what's more pulpy than that? But I prefer the more grounded stories by Ian Fleming. Once again, From Russia with Love, we'll get to in a bit, but that was just chef's kiss, just total perfection. But I've heard there's a point where the James Bond novels start to fall off, and I don't know where that cliff is, but I'm determined to get up through Goldfinger just because I love the movie of Goldfinger so much. But if you are a fan of the Ian Fleming novels, tell me down below at what point does he fall into an inevitable state of decline. But the first 6 books so far have been an absolute blast to read. And one of the most hilarious parts of Dr. No is when James Bond decides to go into training to get into really good shape for the mission where he's going to this island to investigate Dr. No's fortress. And the way Ian Fleming describes this fitness regimen, you can tell just in the 1950s, Ian Fleming's idea of physical fitness is quite different from the fitness of today. It basically involves James Bond going for like short swims followed by sunbathing, a short light jog followed by more sunbathing, and then an evening of like cocktails and cigarettes. And at one point in the mission, he's like, "Oh, I'm sure glad I spent all that time, sunbathing and getting in shape because I'm really feeling the benefits now." But anyway, it was a delightful time capsule or a glimpse inside the mind of Ian Fleming of what he regarded as health and fitness 75 years ago. And having now read Dr. No, it's the perfect excuse to go back and revisit that movie from 63 years ago where, as my friend Tony Stella often points out, it wasn't until Sean Connery was cast in the role that the role of James Bond or the character of James Bond became fully fleshed out, because he does bring something to the character that is missing from the books. Ian Fleming wrote pretty much straightforward, kind of ruthless international espionage sagas, and there's plenty of eating and drinking and screwing and all that good stuff, but that there's a charm and a humor that is absent that Sean Connery brought to the table. But also Sean Connery, he's a pretty ruthless, savage motherfucker in his own right. And a perfect example would be the following scene.
Mr. Smith and Wesson. And you've had your 6.
But obviously, all these decades later, the main appeal of reading and or watching Dr. No is honey. Like, I like the movie Dr. No, but I love that scene between Sean Connery and Ursula Andress on the beach. And I love all the behind-the-scenes pics when they're doing cartwheels and handstands and all that stuff. In any case, more to come on Bond later in this video when we get into From Russia with Love. But for the time being, let's skip ahead to my number 8. We have a new book that was published in 2025. And if you want the full comprehensive review of that book, I'll include a link down in the description below. But we're talking about The Devils by Joe Abercrombie. And I don't have any movie clips for this because it hasn't been adapted yet. However, there's a chance that James Cameron, or at least Lightstorm Entertainment, will do a movie adaptation at some point. Because soon after the book was published, James Cameron scooped up the rights, and he claims he's going to do the screenplay adaptation himself. But the simple pitch for the story is, imagine a medieval fantasy adventure story set in a Europe that is similar to the Europe that we know and love, but a little bit different in terms of which wars were won and lost. And it's also an environment where elves and werewolves and vampires and necromancers and all these things, they're not the stuff of myth and legend, they are real. But the central protagonists of the story, they're basically on a big epic adventure across Europe to try to take a, actually, is this a spoiler or not? They're basically trying to help somebody reclaim a throne from all their relatives. But the team basically includes every single cool supernatural creature that you can possibly think of. Once again, werewolves, vampires, necromancers, elves, etc. And it's basically like the medieval fantasy version of like the Suicide Squad, where this team, they go on these missions all the time, but not all of them always make it to the end, and I'm assuming in the next story there'll be a few new characters, but Joe Abercrombie earned my loyalty for life through the First Law series. And one of the things, I think the most mad I've ever been in the history of like my YouTube consumption was when without naming who, a prominent YouTube commentator was talking about Joe Abercrombie's books, and they suggested that these 3 books, Best Served Cold, The Heroes, and Red Country, were optional because they were standalone stories, whereas like the official narrative was the first 3 and the last 3. And I was like, the best 3 books in the series are those 3 individual books, basically books 4, 5, and 6 in the series. And all those characters are recurring characters before and after. And so it's just incredible how lazy some people can be, even in the world of BookTube, where they claim to be doing the deep dive in all these books. But if you love medieval fantasy and you want to read some contemporary fiction, start with the beginning of the First Law series, read all the way to the end. And if you love it as much as I did, check out The Devils. My only knock against The Devils is that in the middle, it just goes, ugh, and kind of like collapses. Like you almost can feel Joe Abercrombie like audibly going like, getting tired, like I need some coffee or a cigar or something, but like it just somehow just all the tension and all the drama it just bleeds out of the story, but then it surges toward the end. You're like, all right, boom, we're back on firm footing. But once again, I'm a medieval fantasy junkie, and more often than not, it's through video games and books that I get to scratch that itch, because film and television, I mean, we're living in a time where film and television have never been worse when it comes to fantasy on the screen, but luckily books and video games scratch that itch well and thoroughly, and I hope we'll see a movie adaptation of Devils, or at least a good movie adaptation of The Devils, sooner rather than later. And just in case I haven't fully articulated or expressed my love and affection for the work of Joe Abercrombie, his book The Heroes might be the most entertaining novel I've read in the last decade. I'm not saying it's the best. I'm not saying it's the most sophisticated or complex, but in terms of like pound for pound entertainment value, imagine the Battle of Gettysburg, but with like Vikings and soldiers basically battling for over a border, where you have a few spellcasters in the mix as well, but it's written much like The Killer Angels, an incredible novel about the Battle of Gettysburg, where you get to experience the battle over several days from a variety of points of view on both sides. And I've also heard it compared to A Bridge Too Far. But with A Bridge Too Far, I don't feel like you get as much perspective from the other side. But it's a fantastic World War II movie. But yeah, The Heroes, it is lofty praise to compare it to The Killer Angels, which is one of the best novels that I've ever read. But The Heroes, holy shit. That's one of those rare reading experiences where once I started reading it, I just was hugging the book until I was finished. So yeah, Joe Abercrombie, he's one of my favorite living writers. But next up from my number 7, we have yet another medieval fantasy novel published in 2025, but this time by Jay Kristoff, Empire of the Dawn. And I'm not trying to create some sort of rivalry between Joe Abercrombie and Jay Kristoff, because they're very good friends. They tour together. They do Q&As. It's great that we have two fantasy authors at the same time writing cool stuff to get excited about. But I did a more comprehensive review of Empire of the Dawn earlier this year, and I'll include a link to that review in the description below. But after I posted it, this is the way you earn a reader for life. Jay Kristoff DM'd me on X and just said something to the effect of thanks for the review, high five, etc. and so forth. It's like, dude, whatever you write in the future, day one, I'll be the one reading it. But it also helps that he writes insanely entertaining books. I've only read his vampire trilogy, but he's been writing books for a long time. But the first book is Empire the Vampire, and that's one of those rare books where once you start reading it, it is very hard to put down. The simple premise for the trilogy, without going into spoilers, is imagine a medieval fantasy environment where basically the forces of evil won, where the vampires have completely taken over, and now you have warring factions or bloodlines within these vampire kingdoms kind of competing for dominance. And the last Silver Saint, and a Silver Saint is basically, think of him as like a holy knight who likes to drink and screw and cuss a lot, but they're called Silver Saints because they have silver tattoos all over their body that gleam in fighting the undead. But the last and greatest of the Silver Saints is being asked to tell his story to a historian, to a chronicler on behalf of the Empress. And so he just, over the course of 3 books, proceeds to tell his story of how he got to this point. And it is just so goddamn entertaining. And I've got plenty of complaints which I articulate in my review for Empire of the Dawn. But when it comes to just glorious entertainment for adults who not only don't mind, but instead actively seek out hardcore, pornographic sex while people are chopping each other's heads off and drinking the blood and that sort of thing. I mean, it is obscene and depraved in all the best possible ways. But I had an absolute fucking blast reading this trilogy. And my greatest fear is that somebody like Netflix or Prime Video or Apple TV Plus will come along and screw it up trying to turn it into a TV series. But honestly, it could be like a 10-season series, and I would love to see Jay Kristoff get a big payday like that. But I guess I want Jay Kristoff to have that success, but for the love of God, leave these stories alone. Just let people enjoy them on the page because they are so much goddamn fun. So if you're looking for just a really exciting, entertaining, contemporary book, yeah, Empire of the Vampire, Empire of the Damned, and Empire of the Dawn, they will all get the job done. But next up, we have a book that had been on my must-read list for decades, but I finally read Peter Benchley's Jaws, which I think was published 18 months before the release of the movie. But earlier this year, there was the 50th anniversary of Jaws back in June. I did a big giant video celebrating the making of, and it promptly got blocked by Universal. There's been days working on it. So then I did the short version of the video just with behind the scenes images. But part of the enjoyment or the pleasure of preparing for that video was also reading the Jaws log. So I'm going to consider my number 6 kind of a double header or two-fister. You need to read the novel that the movie was based upon because they're quite different in some respects, in particular the middle. But if you want to read about how to develop, shoot, edit, and release a hit movie based on a best-selling novel, this is the Bible. This is the tome that just tells you how to get it done. But when it comes to best-selling fiction being converted into a blockbuster movie, it's tough to think of a more satisfying example where the book's great, the movie's great, and the both have enjoyed this incredible longevity. And I'm going to include a link to my video down in the description below, because the temptation is to simply regurgitate everything already said this past summer, and obviously that's not the goal of this video. But I'll say this: if you think there are no surprises to be had by reading the novel versus seeing the movie, I'll say that the novel's more adult. There's an affair in the middle, and I won't say who is involved. It's like, whoa, this is pretty fucking kinky. I mean, it's two people sitting in a restaurant describing their sexual fantasies, some of which are quite aggressive and lurid. I was like, God damn. But also what's interesting is some of the kill sequences where Peter Benchley writes it from the point of view of the shark itself. And the final confrontation differs quite a bit as well, because there's a lot more acrimony between these three characters on the boat than in the movie, where it's like the ultimate bonding session where three guys are going to war with nature, and they will prevail after they take a few licks and make a few sacrifices of their own. So the novel's a little bit more grim, and I understand why Spielberg felt the need to make it more Spielbergian, if that adjective even exists. So once again, when it comes to a compare and contrast between the book and the movie, just a fascinating case study. I recommend people read and learn and watch everything about that entire saga, because it's one of the most satisfying examples of how to create entertainment in the history of books being made into movies. But it is time now to dive into my top 5. And speaking of books being made into movies, it is time to go back into the world of 007 and James Bond with, hang on, where's it? Oh, here's the copy of From Russia with Love that I read. And there's my collector's copy of From Russia with Love that will always be my cherished copy. And if you're wondering why I have 2 copies of the same book, I feel like there's some copies that go in the bookshelf where they're old and they might fall to pieces. And then you have your other copy that you can like take into the bathtub or throw into a backpack where you don't care what happens to it. And that is this copy. I don't care what happens to it, but this copy I'm going to protect because it's expensive. But From Russia with Love, let me say this just to be abundantly clear. It is my favorite James Bond movie, and it is now my favorite James Bond novel. And it's like the story is so simple and so pure, and I want to be careful because of spoilers, but let's say this. In the novel, James Bond doesn't show up until deep into the text, allowing us a pretty lengthy opportunity to get to know the characters of Red Grant and Tatiana, played by Robert Shaw and Daniele Bianchi in the movie. And they were played to perfection by both those actors, and some of the best scenes in the history of the James Bond franchise, when Sean Connery's reacting in horror to Grant, ordering red wine with fish.
I'll have a bottle of the Blanc de Blanc.
Oui, monsieur.
Make mine Chianti.
White Chianti, monsieur.
No, the red kind.
All those scenes are incredible, and obviously Daniele Bianchi was one of the most beautiful women ever to appear in a James Bond movie. And some of those scenes are pretty goddamn erotic and also hilarious, like in the movie when there's some recording that's sent to M that they're all listening to, when she's like, "Oh, James, when we get to England, will you make love to me all the time?" And he says, "Day and night." And I couldn't find the clip for this video, but anyway, rewatch From Russia with Love. You will laugh just as hard as I did. But From Russia with Love, I just feel like it was one of those moments where for Ian Fleming, of the 6 that I've read, everything just came together in terms of the international espionage, the romance, the tension, the suspense. And once again, it's just James Bond going to the East, having some adventures, picking up this incredibly beautiful girl and this technology that's basically the MacGuffin of the story, and then trying to bring it back to the West as they're being pursued and attacked, etc., and so forth. And it all leads up to this incredible cliffhanger ending. And the movie does not have a cliffhanger ending because obviously the movies and the books were told in a different order. So it doesn't make sense for From Russia with Love to lead into Dr. No, because in the movies the order was reversed. But when you're writing page turners, a good cliffhanger will definitely help keep the reader on the hook for the next book. But this is one of those books where it was just my pores were oozing with pleasure every step of the way. And it reminds me of that line by Ian Fleming where he said his goal was to entertain the reader right down to his taste buds. And this is one of those books where I absolutely was entertained right down to my taste buds. And just to reiterate the point that it is my favorite Bond movie out of all the James Bond movies, here is a whopper of a framed poster. It's so big, I don't know if I can fit it in the frame. But this bad boy, I don't know if you can see anything or not. In any case, this fucker is on my wall here in my apartment. And also, just to add further insult to injury, here I am looking like an absolute psychopath down the Basilica Cistern, one of the most famous locations from the film From Russia with Love. some of the coolest stuff in both the book as well as the movie From Russia with Love is everything that goes down in Istanbul, ancient Constantinople, where there's this character, Karim Bey, who's played by Pedro Armendariz in the movie. And he's one of the coolest side characters in all of James Bond. People love to talk about Felix Leiter being James Bond's buddy and that sort of thing. But when it comes to like a worthy ally who's got a similar worldview and like qualities that James Bond really looks up to and admires, that character is brilliantly portrayed in both the novel as well as the movie. This is just the full package. This is the story where the entire James Bond experience, it all comes together, or at least the James Bond experience as I love it and understand it. And both the book and the movie get my highest possible recommendation. Now, over the course of this list, we've dipped into a bunch of different genres, but let's pause now for my number 4 and dive into the wonderful world of Westerns, courtesy of legendary novelist Elmore Leonard. And when I was first getting into movies in the 90s, there were a ton of movies coming out at that time based on his books. Movies like Get Shorty and Jackie Brown and Out of Sight. And so I initially knew of him as like a crime novelist. But in the 50s and 60s, he wrote a shitload of Westerns, and I've got some of it. My favorite book by him is Cuba Libre, which gets my highest possible recommendation. That's a phrase I keep probably overusing or abusing. Cuba Libre is a one-of-a-kind reading experience, and the Coen brothers even turned it into a screenplay at one point, trying to make it into a movie. But the reason I know about that screenplay is thanks to Western expert David Lambert, with whom I recorded this podcast with William Mendoza, where we tackled 2 legendary movie adaptations of Elmore Leonard's stories. We tackled The Tall T, based on the story The Captives, which I have in this compilation here, and we also tackled Hombre, which I've got right here. And Hombre is very special. It's very good. How can I describe it without giving it away? Well, I'll include a few clips from the trailer. They made a movie of it, which is pretty good, with Paul Newman. I much prefer The Tall T.
Hombre means man, and Paul Newman is hombre.
You can be white, Mexican, or Indian, but I think it pays you to be a white man for a while. Put yourself on the winning side for a change. Is that where you are?
As far as Western adaptations of Elmore Leonard's novels and short stories are concerned, The Tall T might be my favorite Elmore Leonard adaptation. My favorite of all time is probably Out of Sight, but getting back to Hombre, but you have a white man by the name of John Russell who spent most of his life living amongst the Apache, and he's picked up a lot of their skills and a lot of their knowledge and a lot of their expertise, but he's taking his first tentative steps into re-entering the white man's world, a world that he has a lot of bitterness toward because a lot of his friends amongst the Apache have been treated horribly by the white man. But now he finds himself in this stagecoach with several other passengers as they're being pursued by outlaws, and the question is, to what degree does he feel compelled to look after these people, some of whom, like, quite outright fucked over and, like, you know, ruined the lives of many of the people that he regards as, like, as close friends and or family members. So it's a classic scenario where somebody, he's of 2 worlds, and what lengths is he willing to go to in order to protect the interests of the people that he regards as his true family versus the people that are, like, desperately asking for help all around him while they're being pursued by all these outlaws. And the main outlaw is played by Richard Boone in the movie. He's fantastic. You couldn't ask for a better actor to play the main outlaw other than Richard Boone, who also plays the main outlaw in The Tall T. So if you're a Richard Boone fan, I recommend both The Tall T as well as Hombre. But the stories, The Captive and the novel Hombre, holy shit. If you read those, you, like I, will come to the conclusion that you need to read a hell of a lot more Elmore Leonard. And the good news is, he was insanely prolific. I think I've read like 7 or 8 of his novels, and I've barely scratched the surface on his enormous body of work. But now it's time to get into some heavy hitters with my top 3 for 2025. And we're going to dive into yet another genre, another category of storytelling, basically the Napoleonic Wars, courtesy of Patrick O'Brian and the second novel in his legendary series, Post Captain. And I read the first novel many years ago, but barely remembered it, so I reread it like a year or so ago, and I was like, holy shit, this is really fucking good. And like a lot of people, I decided to start reading these books due to the incredible movie made by Peter Weir. And Peter Weir's movie from 2003 with Russell Crowe, it's basically kind of like I wouldn't say a Frankenstein's monster, but it's like a rough assembly from a couple different books. And there are like lines and scenes from Post Captain that made their way into that movie, even though it's a completely different story. But the main reason I'm reading these stories is because my most well-read friend, Nick Berry, who reads, like just an epic tonnage of books in any given year, he's read the entire series twice. Like, people that are into these Patrick O'Brian stories, it is like a religion, it is a subculture. I mean, for decades, going back to the 1970s, people have been obsessing over these books, and they just want to live in this world as long as humanly possible. For a lot of those fans, Post Captain is considered the strongest novel of the series. I preferred the first book just because when I read these stories, I want all that strange jargon and verbiage of like, basically I want all the weird technical lingo, none of which I understand, with all these incredible battles at sea. But with Post Captain, we get a lot of adventures on land. We get a lot of love and romance and relationships and that sort of thing. And that's not really why I'm reading these stories. If I want more land adventures, there are a million other authors, but there's only one Patrick O'Brian, and he writes these Napoleonic war battles better than anybody else. And a lot of people have affectionately described the story as basically Patrick O'Brian's version of a Jane Austen novel. Like, I will read Jane Austen. If I want the Jane Austen experience, when I read Patrick O'Brian, I want to see a small ship taking on a big ship and lots of bloodshed, and that is Patrick O'Brian. But in the end, it just boils down to he created two incredible characters, Jack Aubrey and Stephen Maturin. I've heard that there's actually a debate amongst the fanatics for these stories about how to properly pronounce his last name. Some say like Maturin, some say Maturin. In any case, you tell me, if you love and adore these books, tell me how Stephen's last name is correctly pronounced. But you have the big, bold, badass captain and the brilliant naval surgeon / spy. I feel like every great adventure story, or nearly every great adventure story, nearly always has a really strong friendship at the core of it. Like take the Lord of the Rings. You got, Frodo and Sam, or what's another great example of a great adventure story? Or The Man Who Would Be King. I talked about it earlier, where you've got Peachy and Danny. But if you have two different individuals with different skills coming together and basically forming like one whole being, that is always a great way to get your adventure series up and running. But what I really admire about Patrick O'Brian's approach to these two characters is showing just how different they are and how oftentimes they very nearly flirt with becoming enemies, and then like their friendship will be resumed, but they have very different worldviews, very different values, but they remain the best of friends. Even if every once in a while you're like, oh shit, are they going to have a Pistols at Dawn scenario or whatever the case might be? But they fleshed that out very well in the movie, and they fleshed it out very well in the novel Post Captain. And I'll definitely be reading more of the Aubrey Maturin series. Hang on, the next one is HMS Surprise, which I already own. It's already on my shelf. But you tell me. There are 21 books in the series, and they were published from 1969 to 2004. What are the best novels in this series? Because for me, when it comes to the style, the tone, the setting, they're unlike any other historical fiction that I've ever read, but I'm also nearly a blank slate when it comes to the details of the Napoleonic Wars. So anytime I read these books, I feel like I'm stepping back into a bygone era that no longer exists, but it's just absolutely riveting every step of the way. But I think at this point, I've showered praise on both that movie as well as these books enough. It's time to move on to my number 2. Now, earlier this year, I briefly flirted with this book being my favorite reading experience of 2025, but after long, slow, careful deliberation, I am very satisfied with what I've chosen for my number 1. But for my number 2, One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, which I read in preparation for a 50th anniversary review with my friend Bill Scurry. And it's a movie that I love dearly, that I've seen many times, and I strongly recommend everybody watch it over and over and over again. But the book is just absolutely awe-inspiring. And it's basically been on my reading list my entire life, because throughout middle school and high school, anytime teachers were recommending summer reading where it was optional, One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest was always an option. And it just seemed like there were copies of the book always lying around every school library throughout my childhood, because the movie was an absolute juggernaut. They made the movie for like $3 or $4 million, and it grossed like 164. And it's one of the biggest hits of the 1970s, one of the biggest hits ever up to that time. And it's an extraordinary adaptation of this novel by Ken Kesey, who actually did work in a mental hospital and witnessed all this electric shock therapy and lobotomies firsthand. And I would say when the novel goes to the dark side, it is as horrifying and petrifying as any horror novel I've ever read. And if anything, the novel kind of leans into some of the details, the graphic details of lobotomies and electric shock therapy, much more so than the movie. But what I really find compelling about the novel is that it's all from the point of view of Chief Broom, who's the big, tall Indian who's living in this insane asylum where he's pretending to be deaf and dumb, but he's basically observing this incredible story as it unfolds. But because he's an unreliable narrator and his mind is a little bit off, his imagination kind of fills in the gaps with certain scenarios. So when the big nurse comes onto the hallway, sometimes she quite literally is the big nurse, because his imagination is just running wild. And so you never quite know to what extent he is adding to what he's seeing, or just kind of chronicling what he's seeing. But in the end, this is a story of one man or one individual going up against the system or the Combine. And if you go to Google and look up what is the Combine, according to Ken Kesey, what AI would tell you is that the Combine is Chief Bronwyn's term for the oppressive, mechanized system of society and authority, like Nurse Ratched, that crushes individuality and enforces conformity through control, symbolized by giant machines and a stifling fog representing societal pressure, industrialization, and psychological manipulation that turns people into dehumanized automatons.
Rules? Piss on your fucking rules, Miss Ratched!
Sit down, will you, Cheswick?
I want you to know something right here and now, Miss Ratched. I ain't no little kid.
You sit
I
down.
ain't no little kid where you're gonna have cigarettes kept from me like cookies, and I want something done.
And obviously McMurphy's rebellion against Nurse Ratched is like the tip of the spear in their rebellion against her trying to exercise total control over their lives. But I feel like in any era, for any individual, this kind of story is relevant and fascinating, because I feel like every era will present a new version of the Combine, basically, like, mechanized oppression, trying to force you into conformity and trying to stamp out individuality. I mean, like the movie business, there's probably no better example of that in the world than Hollywood, where any trace of rebellion or individual flavor or style, they're always trying to like eradicate it and destroy it, and like just crap like everybody else does, and we can just like force feed it down people's throats, and we can all pretend like we're having a good time, even if these movies are all boring and interchangeable. But what is undeniable is that the novel of One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest and the movie are not interchangeable. I've never read or seen another story quite like it, but it is easily one of the most intoxicating reading experiences that I've ever had, and it gets my highest possible recommendation, as I keep saying throughout this video, just not quite as high as my recommendation for number one, Pop 1280 by legendary crime novelist Jim Thompson. And I should say, thanks to my video that I did last year about my favorite reading experiences in 2024, I got a recommendation to read this, and as advertised, it's fucking incredible. But last year, I included The Grifters in my list, and I love The Grifters. It's wildly entertaining, but Pop 1280 is one of my all-time favorite books, and how can I put this into words? I would describe this book as the greatest Coen Brothers movie that has never been made, where on the surface, it just feels like fantastic, like hick lit, where you've got this lovable sheriff in the early part of the 20th century, living and working in a small town where all he does all day is take naps, eat large meals, drink booze, and have sex with like 2 or 3 girlfriends that he's kind of working on all at the same time. And the only time he lifts a finger to make any sort of effort of any kind is if there's a problem arising that might possibly interfere with all of his lengthy naps and meals and boozing and screwing and all the things that he likes to do. So as you're reading it, you're like, wait a second, like I thought Jim Thompson was a crime novelist. This just seems like a comedy. And then you realize the central character is a complete and total fucking sociopath, like psychopath, psycho, whatever term you want to use. As I mentioned before, the only time he makes any sort of effort of any kind is when there's a problem that might interfere with his daily pleasures. And sometimes the easiest thing to do is just to murder people and then blame it on somebody else, because he's got all these adversaries who, once again, might interfere with his daily routine. And over the course of the novel, he just finds ways to engineer like their public humiliation or demise or murder or whatever the case might be. And as I was reading it, I was just slack-jawed in awe. And if you want to dig below the surface, you can get into a lot of political commentary and social commentary about the South in the early part of the 20th century. Or if you just want to enjoy a lurid, nasty, hilarious crime saga on the surface, you can also do that too. But this character, Sheriff Nick Corey, he presents so many interesting contrasts, because the entire town thinks he's just like a dim-witted shit kicker who spends all day, every day, just scraping cow manure off his boots. But he's really like a criminal mastermind in ways that are just kind of stupefying to read, when you see all the ways that he's able to maintain and sustain all these competing agendas at the same time. It's like he's juggling 20 flaming batons, but doing so with like one eye open and kind of half snoring. And I was just mesmerized by this character. I was mesmerized by this world. And it's one of those great examples where a lurid, nasty crime thriller, which was probably dismissed and discarded by a lot of people at the time due to its genre, but has managed to last for so long, because it was published in 1964, but it's managed to kind of remain in the public consciousness for so long, it has become a literary classic. And as Bret Easton Ellis is fond of saying, the 2 most dreaded words in the English language are literary fiction. But I think if you write a trashy bestseller, something in like a genre like crime or fantasy or horror or whatever, and it lasts long enough, it becomes literature, whether they like it or not. And the only downside to reading this book is that it didn't have the cover by Robert McGinnis. Back in the day, whether it was movie posters or book covers or whatever, Robert McGinnis is one of the best to ever do it, and I could look at his paintings all day, every day for the rest of my life and consider myself very well entertained. That original cover is just it's chocolate for the eyes, but I tried buying a copy of that version of the book, and it was like $500 So maybe one day I'll give myself a Christmas present and get the original copy of Population 1280. You know what? I don't even know if people refer to it as Pop 1280 or Population 1280. It's the first time we've ever discussed it publicly. It's written like Pop, but obviously Population 1280 because that's how many people live in this little small town that is Nick Corey's world. Long story short, one of the most fun aspects of running this YouTube channel is the two-way street or the open dialogue between me and the viewers in terms of great movie recommendations, great book recommendations. And this is one of those books that I would not have read or would not have discovered if not for people making excellent recommendations down in the comments below. So I strongly encourage everybody, make your recommendations, whether it's like something related to something I already discussed or just one of those books where you're like, dude, your life is not complete unless you've read this one particular novel. And I'm old enough now where I feel like I need to start getting to all those books that have been on my list for decades. Like I might get hit by a bus tomorrow, and there are at least like 50 to 100 novels out there where I've been pretending as if I'm going to read them at some point in my entire life. But I'm not going to live forever. It's time to read those goddamn books. So let her rip down in the comments below, and I promise I will write down all those recommendations and add them to my ever-growing list, and I will try to prioritize them to the best of my ability. But thank you for sticking with me for this list. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you enjoy checking out some of my recommendations. Or if you want to push back and say, dude, the recommendations you made are fucking terrible. Like, what are you doing including X on the list? By all means, let me have it as well. I've got thick skin, and my pride can take it. But I hope some people will look at this list and think, hey, a paperback like One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, what a perfect stocking stuffer. It'll slide right in. And once again, inexpensive entertainment. The price is right when it comes to books. So thank you so much for considering all the books that I've recommended today. And I eagerly look forward to reading all the recommendations down below. But if you enjoyed this video, please consider liking, subscribing, hitting that notification bell. But more importantly, as always, onwards and upwards.